Welcome back to another episode of the Leading Saints podcast, and I am still in my home office for those that are watching via video, and it's still being painted, and that's not because I haven't addressed it in a week. It's that I recorded this episode and the previous episode in the same day, so my lighting's off. I mean, this is terrible. I got this light here, but hey, that doesn't matter what I look like. What matters is we get good quality content on the Leading Saints podcast, and that's what this is. You guys, last week's episode that you heard, so good, right? Devin, Pope, and Southside Chicago, just so good, right? And this episode with Becca, Woolf, in Spokane, Washington, I'm just like, I just sit here in awe. Like, I'm so honored that I get to be the person that organizes, talks into the mic, asks questions about these beautiful leadership experiences. So Becca talks about her journey, not only her journey to find leading saints and crying in the celestial room, and a blessed temple worker, I don't know who you are out there, but bless your heart, a blessed temple worker saw her crying in the temple, in the celestial room, and said, anyway, she gets in the story, but it leads to her recommending leading saints. And then Becca tells her story about 6 months prior to being called as Relief Society president, sits her husband down and says, I think I'm leaving the church. Okay. I mean, these stories just are full of God's glory. When 6 months later, she talks about that journey. She's in a place where she accepts this calling as Relief Society president, and her faith, her testimony is just so beautiful. This is what Zion's about. This is what the gospel's about. You're gonna love this episode. Share it. You must. I implore you to share this with a fellow or another Relief Society president. They gotta hear it. Another member of the church. I mean, everybody needs to hear it. So here we go. Here's my interview with Becca Woolf from Spokane, Washington. All right, Becca Woolf, welcome to the Leading Saints podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me here.
Now, this started with an email you sent me, which is, yep. I guess there's a story behind it. Maybe let's just start there. What's the story behind the email that you sent me?
Yeah, I had never, I was released as a Relief Society president and called as Young Women's president, like right back to back.
Wow.
And felt really, really, really overwhelmed by being called as Young Women's president, and also so sad about being released as Relief Society president. So I was in the temple, like in the interim between, like, I knew, but no one else knew. Mm-hmm. So I was still acting as Relief Society president, but knew that the roles were changing. And I was in the temple one morning, and I ended up being in the celestial room by myself, except for one little worker, and I was sobbing. And the worker came over and was like, do you need someone to come talk to you? And I first said no. And then I was like, I mean, sure, why not? So the temple matron came and talked to me, and she just, was so sweet and told me lots of things, but she had mentioned your podcast and said, I just listened to a podcast about a bishop who was grieving, and it was so great. And it's normal to grieve when you are released from these callings. And so then over the next series of days, I spent so much time on your podcast because I just felt so much pressure from so many different angles. And so then I wrote you a thank you note and was super surprised to get a response. I know that you were busy, and then now we're here. So
yeah. Well, I really appreciate that. And it means a lot to just know that this work we do, makes a difference in an individual's life.
Definitely did mine.
And I love hearing it shared in the celestial room.
It definitely was. Yeah, Leading Saints podcast, straight in the celestial room. Yeah,
that's great. Now, going back to that, when you say you were in the episode series, it's a 2-part episode series that we put together. It's called When Being Released Hurts. And we'll link to it, of course, in the show notes. When you said that you were, I forget the word you used, sad or
grieving,
right? Like maybe go into that more. What was it you were grieving or hurting about? Was it the resentment? Was it the feeling that you didn't do enough, or regret? Or how would you articulate that?
I loved being Relief Society president. So it was just sadness. I moved into this ward and was called. We moved to Washington, and I was called a few months afterwards to be the Relief Society president. So I knew no one. And much of my time in those 2.5, 3 years was spent just getting to know people. So I felt like I just felt like I had just loved these sisters with all of my heart, and suddenly, like, it was just gone. And I didn't anticipate, I anticipated being in this calling for a little bit longer than that. My bishop joked often, like, I'm keeping you until I get released. And I knew that was just a joke, but I just thought I had more time. But about a month leading up to being called, I was in the temple again and got this really strong revelation that I was going to be released as Relief Society president and called as Young Women's president. So you'd think I'd be prepared, but I just wasn't. I wasn't prepared to lose that mantle, I guess. And I didn't feel regret. I felt like I gave it my all. I just loved it. I loved it so much.
Yeah. That's great. And I want to normalize just that experience more. That's why we did that series and having this conversation, that, it's not like people shouldn't, or, that your bishop or other leaders should have done more so that you didn't feel this way. It is what it is, right? It's just mortality, and that's how you felt, and that's how your mind and body was processing it. And that's okay. It does make me think of, as a bishop, which I think, Relief Society president is very similar to that bishop role, as far as the heaviness of the calling at times and the responsibility. As a bishop, you sort of have this idea of like about 5 years, and everybody's sort of on board with that, or and obviously it's different for maybe different areas, but how helpful is for maybe a bishop or somebody to say, hey, this is what I'm thinking. I'm thinking maybe in the next year that we should start thinking about that, just sort of giving you a heads up, just so it doesn't sneak up on you too much. Because I think that just adds to, doesn't get rid of the processing, the mourning or whatever, but it maybe will help you anticipate it more and prepare for it that way. So very interesting. Very interesting.
Yeah. And I think, I think my bishop, I think he struggled with the change himself. Like I think it took a lot of, when he called me as Young Women's president, he was in tears, because I think he tried so hard to know if that was the right thing to do as well. And I think God gave me that clear knowledge in the temple a month earlier that the transition was going to happen, almost to be like, hey, like, I actually think this is the right thing to do, but it was still just hard. I don't think if I had had a year to prepare, it would have been any less hard. Change is hard. When you put your whole heart into something, it's just going to be hard.
Yeah, it's just hard. I think that's a great way to sum it up there. So now you're in Spokane, Washington. So pretty solid area as far as the church goes. There's members around, but so anything else? And we're going to talk about your time as Relief Society president. And when were you released as Relief Society president?
I was released in July, so it's only been 3 months.
Couple months. Okay. And how long were you the Relief Society president?
Over 2.5 years.
Okay.
So somewhere in between there in 3 years. Yeah.
Okay. Pretty typical for sure.
Yeah.
And anything about your ward, the demographics, how it's laid out that would be worth mentioning as before we launch into a discussion about that experience?
Our ward is super long and skinny. It's like not even, I think it's like 2 or 3 blocks wide. And then it's just like 20 miles long. And so that houses,
holy cow,
like my house is at the top on the south side, and then it goes all the way down to the north. And the further, it just creates a different socio-economic, standpoint from all the different places. Spokane itself isn't super diverse from like a race standpoint, but we definitely had, low income, and we had people that had a lot of money. So
yeah, cool, very cool. So I want to go back to, you mentioned this sort of as a side note leading up to this discussion, that your journey on being called as a research president, a little bit atypical, but maybe not so much. I don't know. We'll find out, see who resonates with it. But you said about 6 months prior to being called as Relief Society president, you had a very serious conversation with your husband as far as what would happen if you left the church. There's a lot to unpack there. So how would you sum up just your faith journey story that got you to a point of having that conversation with your husband?
Yeah. So, I grew up in the church. I have super wonderful parents. My mom actually, her name's Shawna Edwards. She writes a bunch of primary music.
Oh, wow.
And my dad worked for the church for 10 years. He created gospel library and LDS tools. Like I grew up with parents that really truly believe. So, and that was a blessing. I married a husband who's very similar. Like he just has this strong faith. I'm a questioner at heart, and I question a lot of things, and that wasn't a problem until I was on my own. And as in my 20s, I just started questioning a lot of the things in the church, and I didn't really know where to turn, and it felt lonely. And so, I have a really close relationship with Landon, my husband, and we talked ad nauseum about all the stuff, but kind of a series of being on Instagram a lot and COVID happening, we moved a bunch, a little bit of some mental health maybe. I just slowly started to feel I just didn't believe. And I remember being in Kentucky and sitting in sacrament meeting right after COVID. It was March of 2021, and we hadn't been to church for almost a year. And we had gone back to church. I was sitting in sacrament meeting, and we were singing and taking the sacrament. And I was like, what is this? What am I doing? And I happened to turn open. I don't remember if I chose to go to the article of faith or I just turned open, but I read that first article of faith. We believe in God, the eternal Father, and in his son, Jesus Christ, and in the Holy Ghost. And I was like, I don't even know if I believe in God. I don't even know. So within a couple of weeks, my sweet bishop in Kentucky, Bishop Parker, we were there for 6 months. When church was open, we were there. He gave both of us callings. I don't know why he did that, but it was really sweet of him to do that. And he visited us, and I had never opened up about my faith, but 2 weeks before we moved, he asked if he could give me a blessing just randomly. So we went into his office, and he told me, he gave me a blessing. And in the blessing, he told me two things. He told me to share my doubts with people, to be really open about it. And he said to hold on to the drops of faith that I had. And so then we moved from Kentucky to Washington, and was really overwhelmed. And we were in this new community, and I thought, this is dumb. I just need to decide now, because I don't want to start in this community. It's hard to leave the church. If I'm going to leave the church, I'm going to leave the church before I meet all these people.
Which is very typical to leave the church with a move. Like a lot of people, that happens with a lot of people. Yeah.
Which makes sense. You haven't fallen in love with the people. And while that's a good part and a good reason to be in a church community, it should not be the reason. You should be there for Jesus and for God. So I just said to Landon, I don't feel this. I don't believe this. And I don't know if there's a God. Maybe I should stop going. And always in his wisdom, he's like, okay, great. And I was like, are you going to be mad at me? Is our marriage going to be affected? And he just said, no, what? I love you. And that's what you need to do. Great. And I'm still going to take the boys to church. So good luck. And I mean, obviously much more personal than that, but there was never this, what are you going to do to our family? You'll hurt us so much. And I think that he gave me the freedom in that moment to be like, okay, what do I want? I have all this freedom, and I have all the love and support from him. So what do I want to do? So I was talking to a non-member, a Christian friend of mine, and I asked her how, what she felt like her church did really well. And she's like, we know who God is. And so I said, how do you know who God is? And she said, we read the Old Testament, and you can get to know God in the Old Testament. And if you want to know who God is, read the Old Testament. And I said, okay.
I wouldn't expect that. That's the Old Testament God? All right, here we go.
I know. I was like, okay, I will do that. So I decided I'm just going to start reading the Old Testament. And I think that those few things helped. I felt like I had this desire to figure out if God was real and if he was there. And that was kind of the start off of I'm not going to leave yet. I'm going to just start with something so basic. But it was kind of in that moment that I got called as Relief Society president. So I was
Wow.
started off with a pretty fragile testimony.
Yeah. So I want to go back a little bit. A few things you mentioned. Um, you mentioned Instagram, and this is something I've got a closet full of soapboxes that I could stand on about social media, Instagram, especially like the negative impacts on this in the most subtle ways, especially uh, for women.
Yeah.
But tell me, like, because the way I would frame it is that, like, I have no problem with individuals like asking questions, like investigating things, like reading really stuff that that's sort of raw and real, and especially related to church history or theology or doctrine, whatever it is. But the nature of like social media or TikTok or Instagram or Reels or all these things, like the way that information is communicated that way, it's just generally just in a negative way that it
Yeah.
can really stimulate doubts more than other platforms, right? So, I mean, anything you'd add to that? Am I off my rocker, or what comes to
No.
mind when you say Instagram?
I mean, for some reason, I think my spirit always knew that Instagram wasn't good for me. So I never had it to begin with. But
Hmm.
for some reason, actually, I started, I started doing come follow me chats with my boys and I would put up the little chats on Instagram. And I was honestly doing it to teach my boys the gospel. So it was like in 2018, 2019, and I would just do that. But what ended up happening is I would post it and then I would just find myself on Instagram for a while. And
So
then
so just be clear, you would like have a conversation with your boys and then share it on Instagram, or what do you
no,
mean
I
by
would
that?
just like I would kind of just map out like this is the 3 questions I'm going to ask my boys this morning about
Oh, okay.
this scripture, and I put it on like a 3x5 card. I took a picture of it and I put it on Instagram. It
Oh,
was
cool.
very
Yeah,
like informal.
yeah, yeah,
Um, and definitely wasn't doing it to like become something famous. I just wanted a place to keep it, and
yeah,
Instagram is a nice place to keep things.
yeah.
But I found myself once I started that, um, just being on Instagram, which I, I was like, well, I'm doing something good, so what's the problem? And then it's just really easy to find people that think like you. So I had doubts about a lot of things in the church, and you can just find someone else that has a doubt that way. And I could not deny like, and even to this day, I don't really go on Instagram because I can see my testimony slide every time because I can
Mm,
find someone that shares their doubts or shares why they don't believe anymore. And I'm like, oh man, yeah, that makes sense. That's hard.
yeah.
I don't believe. So I really had to get to this point where I had to decide where are my sources going to come from. And I know that often it's like, well, you should go to the church website or you should go to the scriptures. And I've always read my scriptures. So I was reading the Old Testament, but I had my sources be the people that I knew loved me the most. My
Mm.
husband, my parents. One time I was talking to my brother Gary, and I was like, Gary, I don't believe. And he said, Becca, how long have you been a member? I was like, 22 years. And he's like, okay, take 22 years. Take 22 more years to decide if you don't believe, and then leave. And I was
Oh,
like,
that's
okay,
interesting. Yeah,
yeah,
that's cool.
I can take my time on this. So I don't know, Instagram just,
Yeah,
maybe it really helps some people, but I just
yeah.
found that when it came to my testimony, being on there was really detrimental.
Yeah, that's interesting. It's a fascinating discussion. I'm probably not expert enough to really delve into it, but and I'd also never want to be the leader or the husband or the friend who would say don't read that, like, because it's anti-Mormon, like,
Right.
stay right. But at the same time, I would say, like ask all the questions and sure, read all the contrary opinions and perspectives, but maybe don't do it on social media, right? Even like a YouTube dynamic, because it's just the way it's designed, algorithms, it kind of can, it leads to like rumination on some of these things, and the algorithm just beats you over the head with more, right? And
Right.
there's not a lot of space. And so I love how the what you said earlier of I you decided to go to those, the primary resources would be those individuals who loved you. Like, I think that's powerful, really
Yeah.
powerful. So,
Yeah. And I think it makes sense that people turn to social media because, and this isn't anyone's fault, but we still are working on having a church where we can talk about the things we're
mhm,
struggling with.
yeah,
And that just takes a lot of vulnerability. And I think that it's easier to be vulnerable on Instagram. And so if we could create these church houses where someone can come in and say, hey, you know, my child's gay and they're leaving the church and this is really hard for me, without feeling like you have like a bunch of judgment coming your way, you know. And I do think we're getting better at that. I just think that it makes sense that people turn to social media. But I learned in my own experience that turning to the people I knew loved me and having those discussions with them was the right place for me.
Yeah, that's powerful. Because on social media, they're willing to have any conversation, right?
Right. And they don't know
And
you.
yeah, exactly. Yeah,
They don't know you.
yeah. That's powerful. So, would you say, is it just sort of hearing a summary of your faith journey there? Was there, like, as some people frame it, like the dark night of the soul moment where you just question everything, like it was, and it was just this emotional, like wreckage of life and belief, or it seemed maybe more subtle. You sort of dip in and out and weren't sure, and then you thought you were sure, but yeah.
I think that I had to, my husband always talks about faith not being a perfect knowledge, and
Mhm.
how I had to choose it. And he was like, Becca, you gotta just choose a direction. Like, stop sitting in this unknown.
Yeah,
Stop being like, I don't know. Just, and you know, and,
yeah,
and that's just so hard. I don't even have, I don't know. It's just always been subtle. I actually think I will always have questions. And I think my faith will always be something I have to fight for.
yeah,
I don't think that, and I think that's okay. I,
yeah,
I'm
absolutely.
I'm grateful for that now because I feel like I can relate to a lot of people. I feel like I'm I'm now at the place where I'm like, you know what? I can see all the good that comes from this, and if this is the fight I have to have, then I'll just keep fighting it.
Hmm. Yeah.
So
And would you say, and maybe this doesn't matter, or belaboring the point, but um, was there a certain, was it the like church history issues for you, theology, social issues? I mean, was there a thing that really
yeah,
was more difficult, or was it just everything?
I mean, it was probably everything. I think I have this like giant heart who loves everybody. Um, and I think I also can see people on the outside, and I want to defend the outsider. And so, you know, I don't understand how um our LGBTQ friends manage faith and their love. You know, like that's a really hard thing for me. And I think for a while there was some church history stuff, but um I don't know. Landon's always like, you got to just be kind to the past. Like, we don't know what it's like. And similar to like Instagram, like they don't know me and I don't know them. So to judge these people that are so far back that I don't have really strong relationships with, it's probably not fair. So,
Yeah.
but
Yeah.
yeah, I think it was kind of a mixture. And there's probably some mental health in there too. I just, for a long time, couldn't feel him. So that felt
Hmm.
frustrating.
Yeah. Man, that's such a, to me, in my opinion, that's such a healthy way to sort of frame everything, because even from a, like an orthodox leadership standpoint, we want to be like, oh, Becca has questions about like Joseph Smith's polygamy, so I'm going to get her the answers and that'll fix it. When in
Right.
reality, it's like, well, yeah, you might get them the answers, but it might be a tough mental health day, or, you know, there's
Right.
just so, obviously as humans, we're complex,
Yeah.
meat machines here, so, yeah.
I always really cringe when anyone says something like, well, they left the church because they stopped doing the things. Like they stopped
Yeah.
reading their scriptures and they stopped praying. And I felt like I was doing those with all my heart.
Yeah.
Um, and you know, the adversary is strong. Like, who's to say he can't get into the person that's reading their scriptures and saying their prayers and trying their hardest? Like, I think sometimes we forget that even the people that come from the strongest stock, who are the leaders, like, of course the adversary is going to try to get them.
Hmm.
You know, why wouldn't he? So I I don't know. I really think that there has to be like a tender conversation with someone that is struggling. Like, you know, what are you doing to try to strengthen your relationship with God? Um,
Yeah.
and and I'm sorry. And you take 22 years. You take 22 years to figure this out, and I'll be here on the other end.
Yeah. All right, so let's step back into your, like, your leadership journey, your narrative here. That, okay, so 6 months prior to being called as lead site president, you have this discussion, and flash forward 6 months, you're in the bishop's office, and he's extending this call, and like now you're super on board and just happy to do it, or like how did you navigate that with your with your faith journey?
Yeah. So, I mean, maybe I should make it clear that this bishop had no idea where I was with my faith, because we now are in a new ward with a new bishop. He comes over to my house. Landon and I think he's coming over to get to know us. Like, we're still new in the ward. We actually forgot he was coming, and we went to bed. And then I was like, wait, Landon, didn't Bishop text you and say that he wanted to come over? And he was like, oh yeah. So we like run downstairs and turn on our lights and pretend like we're like ready for him and had been preparing for him. And then, yeah, he just was like, I don't really know why, but you're super young and you just moved into this ward, but God wants you to be the Relief Society president. And, you know, I think people say this all the time, but that calling, I mean, it probably saved my life. It probably saved my kid's life. You know, maybe I would have found my way back, but it definitely sped up. It definitely gave me the opportunity to speed up what I was hoping for, which was to know God. So yeah, he just called me and I didn't sleep ever again. So
yeah.
That's.
And did you say in that initial meeting, did you bring up these struggles at all, or
actually, I got called to speak in state conference a couple of months later, and I gave a talk that really like outlined this. I was called to speak in the leadership session, and I felt really prompted to share my story. I mean, Bishop Parker told me to share my story, so I shared that story, and it was 13 minutes, and I like watched my bishop's like face, like the blood go out of his face. He's like, I called a Relief Society president who didn't have a testimony. Like, what? So, I mean, I know he wasn't like upset or anything, but that's when he found out.
Yeah. Interesting. So, but in that moment, like, you felt like you'd come to a place that, again, you, like you said, you'll probably have questions the rest of your life or be in that state, but you felt like, I can do this, you know, with integrity, knowing that, you know, I'm still sort of navigating some things, but yeah, I can step up and lead like that.
I mean, I knew that I could love, and I knew that I could help. I also was very open with everyone I talked to that I was trying to figure things out. Everyone knows. Everyone knew. All the sisters, like when I started meeting them, when I was in Relief Society, when we did councils, when I was in their home, I just talked about it. So I didn't feel like I felt like I was just authentic. I felt like I just was very honest. And it felt like, I think being brand new was really a blessing. The Relief Society president came over to my house and was like ready to tell me all the people that were struggling. And I actually asked her not to tell me anything. I was like, listen, I have a clean slate here. I don't even know people's names. Yeah. Like, I get to knock on someone's door and be like, hi, I'm Becca. I just moved to this state. You're on the roster. Tell me about yourself. And it was so nice to be able to do that. Anyways, I just felt like I could really, the being new and being vulnerable, I think created an atmosphere in our Relief Society that allowed these sisters who had strong testimonies, like, so grateful for them, to like just cheer me on and help me, but also they were more vulnerable. And then the sisters who were struggling with their testimony was like, oh my gosh, the Relief Society president doesn't know if there's a God. I mean, that's probably too harsh. I was working on that. I definitely had all the desire and all the belief that God was there. I was just working on it. But I think it helped them feel like, okay, I don't have to know as much as I think I need to know to be here.
Yeah. Okay, so unpack that more, because I'm curious, like, because this principle of authenticity is a big one, right? And I think every leader listening knows the power of authenticity, wants it to be part of the culture of whatever organization they're leading. And so, is there more to say, like, how do you show up that way? Again, because you don't want to be like, there's parts of all of our lives, I feel like, that we're not settled or we're still navigating, where it would almost be inappropriate. I don't know, like if I'm struggling with some mental health issues and I'm not in a good space, like that can spin out of control real quick because I'm not grounded in it. And so I want to be authentic, but I also don't want to like spiral out of control and send others spiraling out of control, right?
Right.
So, unpack that more as far as like how do you show up and be authentic in that state, or just and being you. Like if you were to train a room full of Relief Society presidents, where would you start with that?
Well, I mean, I think, and I'm hoping to train the young women this now. I think to be, in authentic in this way, and to be a great leader, like I can't ask my sisters to do anything that I wasn't willing to do. So
Mm-hmm.
one way that I was going to be authentic to the Relief Society is I was going to study my scriptures. And one way I was going to be authentic is I was going to go to the temple and I was going to pray. And I was going to show up at church and I was going to magnify my calling. Those were ways that I feel like I just wasn't going to ask anyone to do anything that I wasn't willing to do myself.
Yeah.
And so I don't know if that answered your question, but
yeah, a little bit. But I'm just curious, like, did you find yourself raising your hand in class and making comments that are more authentic, or did you start the meeting off just saying, "Let me tell you about my story"? Or
yeah, no, that's a good question. I think it was just natural. Like I shared it when I felt like it. I wasn't hiding it. I think I wasn't just like pushing it on people, but
yeah,
I didn't like step into the role and be like, I don't have a testimony. I just I think I just shared like, yeah, I really have a hard time with that too. And I'm working on my testimony right now too. And I'm reading the Old Testament and to try to get to know God more. And I think it was just, when the moment happened, I would share that I didn't know everything. I knew very little. So.
And did you feel like you maybe needed to not teach as much because you couldn't really stand there authentically and get into certain doctrine, or?
I mean, things that I believed when I was called, I believe that loving everyone is important. I believe that family is important. I believe that, I believed that desire was important. So that's a good question. I remember in Kentucky when I was in the primary presidency and I was really struggling with my faith, that I was asked to teach on prayer to the kids. And I just had to be I wasn't going to lie. So I had to really work through myself, like, okay, what do I believe here? And what am I willing to come out of my mouth?
Yeah.
So I don't really remember exactly what I did. I think my first lesson was Mother's Day, and we talked about the women in the Bible and what they did. And then we just had discussions on, how does this inspire us, which I didn't really have to like have a super strong testimony. That was, how can this inspire us to be good was enough. Like being good is important. Even if I'm struggling with my testimony, I can try to help women and inspire them to be just a little bit better.
Yeah. Yeah, that's powerful. That's good. Did it, and not that we want to single anybody out who may be listening, but I mean, how did other sisters respond to, I mean, did you get wind of like people going to the bishop being like, hey, you do know that Becca's sort of not totally in? Like,
I don't know.
I mean, did any of that come up?
I don't think so. I think everyone was cheering me on. I mean, listen.
Oh, cool. That's
I was
awesome.
one of the youngest ones in the ward. I was brand new. I was open that I was really struggling with my testimony. I don't think there was, if there was, I didn't know about them. I'm sure. I mean, I know that maybe there were people that weren't happy with me at some points, but I just felt so much love from everybody. It just felt like people were cheering me on.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think, I mean, there's so many dynamics to consider here, but like, I'm just thinking of those leaders who are maybe like, because there's this pressure of sitting in a bishopric meeting and we're talking about callings. There's this pressure of like, well, if we're going to call a Relief Society president, let's make sure we call the super member, who's really in, because we need that example. Right. And so we dismiss some names from the list to be considered, but the beauty of revelation, like leading your bishop here, even when he maybe was unaware of what your journey was, and then which led to more authenticity, and then it led to this group of women who were cheering you on, and it's just beautiful, even though it's like some may frame it as not ideal, right?
Totally. And
but it's awesome.
I understand the scary element of a bishop and a bishopric trying to decide about calling someone who doesn't have a strong testimony like that, who openly shares, or I don't know, maybe our actions need to speak for us a lot. Like if we see someone who is being open about what they're struggling, but they're there regularly and they're being kind to people, and I think that, and you know, they're willing, I think that those are good things. Obviously,
Yeah.
if we have someone up there just breaking all the rules or breaking their covenants, you know,
Yeah,
I'm
exactly.
not necessarily sure if that's the right person to call, but I don't know. Revelation, follow the
Yeah.
revelation.
Yeah, fascinating. I really love that. All right, let's as we do in these How I Lead interviews, I had you send me 3 principles that helped you in your leadership. And if any of these spill over to your, because you're now the Young Women's president, right? And we can
Yeah.
talk in that context as well. But first one being visiting sisters in their home at least once a year. Tell me more about that.
Yeah, that just is in the handbook. That one stuck out to me. I think I was so eager to get to know these sisters. Um, I mean, I remember the first month that I was called, uh, I called every sister on the phone. I still had a 9-month-old and he took naps. And so every nap and every nighttime, I would set up these appointments and I would just call and just be like, for 30 minutes, chat with the sister. Um, we have about 60 active sisters. So I called every sister on the phone just to get to know them a little bit more. But then I was pretty diligent about finding a way to be in their home once a year. Sometimes it was like, you know, if I was in someone's home for a scripture study and I visited with them for a little bit, that was enough. But it was often like I would just go visit them on Tuesday nights or after church on Sunday. I was constantly, I guess you could say, dating them. Like I kind of attuned, like, you know, my husband talks, I mean, we still go on regular dates, and it's, you know, these relationships are not, in order to have people and inspire people, you have to know them. And to know them, it takes a lot of time. And so I just wasn't willing to ask anyone to do something if I didn't also know that their mom just broke their arm in the hospital, or I didn't know that their little one was really struggling to eat, you know, any type of food. Like I needed to know them before I could ask them to do anything. So I think at least, I mean, the whole time, but certainly up front, that was all of my focus, was just getting to know them.
Yeah. Yeah, that's awesome. Anything else as far as the yearly visits that we worth mentioning?
I did drop off, like I had a list of all the birthdays. And so the super inactive sisters, I would drop, I hate phrasing it that way. The ones I didn't know,
Yeah.
the sisters I didn't know, I would drop stuff off at their house and often not know them, or often not get a response. I didn't really care that much about cleaning up our roster. I didn't want to spend my time doing that. I was willing to just drop stuff off at people's homes. There was one time about a year into our presidency that my presidency and I decided that we should do like a blitz. And so we blitzed all these sisters' homes that I was unable to get in. And nothing came of that, except for a bunch of sisters that were willing to follow the response of their Relief Society president asking them to come do the blitz. Nothing else
Yeah.
came from that, but we
Oh,
tried.
interesting. Yeah, I love that, and I appreciate you saying that, because sometimes you're like, "We should do this," and it kinda doesn't work, you know, and that's okay. Just
Yeah.
move on to the next idea, you know?
Yeah.
So, that's awesome. All right, next principle, and I'm just gonna insert this. I've gotta ask, do you have a pink piano behind you? Oh my goodness, look at
It's
that.
just painted. It's not a
You
real
painted
instrument.
it?
Yeah.
It's not a real piano, or what do you say?
No, it is a real piano, but someone that like is a pianist would call this furniture and not an instrument, because you're not really supposed to paint instruments, you know?
Okay.
So I have
Awesome.
4 boys. I shouldn't have a pink piano, but I had to get some feminine in here. So
Awesome. Love it. Sorry, my ADD I just had to ask. So this
no,
next
that's great.
segment is brought to you by Pink Pianos. So
Yeah.
here we go. All right, next one is ministering, which we're all, you know, Elders Quorum president, Relief Society president's always curious about. Ministering circles and ministering interviews. Go.
Oh, this was my favorite part of the calling for sure. I have to say that I had an incredible presidency. I when I was called, Bishop told me to call people that had the strengths that were my weaknesses. So I called sisters who had strong testimonies to help me compensate. I also called sisters that, well, anyway, so I just have to thank those 3, 4, 5. Actually, I had 5 at one, like I had a bunch, for all their help. But we just decided really early on that I believe people in this church are constantly trying to do good. And I really dislike the rhetoric of I'm a bad minister. So I was like, when we did ministering interviews and one of my sisters would tell me they were a bad minister, I'd be like, shut up. Like that is not true. Like you literally just picked up this little girl from school and took her to her mom's house. Or like, I know that you had this family over for dinner. Like I know that, like, so I started like seeing this idea that like, oh, I'm such a bad minister. I was like, what are you talking about? You're constantly doing good. That's what ministering is. So we had this discussion as a presidency of how can we make ministering more authentic? And we ended up, we had this idea of creating groups instead of companionships. And these groups, so we had this idea of creating groups. So then we went to the Relief Society and we had a council about it because in the handbook it talks about counseling, and we said we're thinking about changing ministering. We wondered what you guys thought of changing from companionships to groups, and being in a group of 6 and kind of like taking care of each other. And they were like, yeah, we love it. Let's do it. So then we asked questions like, would you prefer being ministering sisters to people that are really close to you in proximity? Would you prefer being ministering sisters to your friends? Or would you prefer being ministering sisters to whoever? And we kind of got in that's what we did with one of our ministering interviews, is we just asked those questions. And they shared their thoughts. And it was a really cool experience because we got all these thoughts, we compiled all the information, and the 4 of us got together and we said a prayer. And within 1 hour, we had revamped all of ministering. And it was definitely led by God. Like ministering is a lot of work, but this just like came. We put friends with each other. We put people that are close to each other. We put like in proximity, it just felt like suddenly we were, we had all these circles, and we introduced it, and people were excited about it. It ended up, I've now heard other people doing it. I started sharing this in our stake, and a lot of our other wards in the stake have kind of shifted, and I know it's different for every ward. But a lot of things happened from this where like we released the compassionate service leader because she was no longer needed. Like when a sister had a baby, there was 5 other sisters there to support her. And when the sister lost her husband, there was a whole stake there to support her, but she had 5 sisters right there cleaning her house and ready and willing to take her dogs and help her with that. So we paired these women with their friends, a lot of them with some of their friends. And we have a blessing in our ward that there are no cliques. So I just didn't worry about that. And I think that made it easier. Like, it's not like people are like, oh, I'm not in the cool ministering circle, but, they just were, and then we started this rhetoric of like, and then it just became easy. Like these sisters were calling the people that they would naturally call to help them. And then suddenly they're like, oh, I am ministering. Like, so often I feel like we think we need to pair like complete strangers with each other and then have those 2 strangers with a stranger. And sometimes that's great. And obviously Revelation takes a key, but sometimes it's okay to pair best friends and let them know that they're doing God's work by taking care of each other.
Yeah. So. Yeah, that's powerful. Love that so much. While we're in the topic of ministering, is there anything that's worked for you, or any tips you give from what you've learned about ministering interviews as far as getting them done, or I don't know what you say, or
we always prepared 3 questions. We only did ministering interviews in that first month of the quarter. because I refuse to have my whole life be ministering interviews.
So
So I
true.
was
Yeah.
like, I told my presidency, like, I don't care what you have going on. We are getting our interviews done this month.
Uh-huh.
I feel like there are very few things we can be perfect at. We can't be perfect. We can be perfect in our tithing, and I feel like we can be perfect in our ministering interviews. They
Yeah.
don't have to be super formal, but we have a way of connecting to our sisters. Even if it's like, hey, I know you're super busy. Here's a text message. You know, how is it? How are you doing? How is your sister just doing? Anything we need to know. And a lot of times we would ask, you know, where's your faith? The question we asked right before I was released was, what's your relationship like with the temple? And we got all this information back from 60 sisters of their relationship with the temple. So yeah, I think we asked 3 questions. I even had my secretary interview because that just divided up a little bit more. And we try to keep them brief. We try to say, like, we only need you for 10 minutes. We did with the circle, you know, often you do companionships, but with a circle, we interviewed each person individually. So we were often interviewing somewhere between 40 to 55 sisters individually and connecting with them every quarter. And that was such a blessing because then we just knew what was going on in people's lives, no matter what.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. So these 3 questions, so those would change every time you just come together as a presidency, decide we're going to ask these 3 questions. And
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Like, I mean, often the first one was almost always, how are you? How are you doing? Tell us about what's going on. And then the second one was always, you know, anything we need to know about your sisters or you're concerned about. And then there would be a third one, you know, what's your relationship like with the temple? What's the best way to reach you? Is there something that you feel like you can offer to the word that we don't know about? I can't think of all of them, but we would often, we would just come up with
Wow.
what we felt like we wanted to know about the sisters to get to know them more.
Yeah, that's great because some of them are like more thoughtful or spiritually related. Others are just more practical, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
A chance to get more information.
All right, last one is prayer and fasting. So you talked about your time as teaching primary about prayer, but I mean, you're on the prayer train, sounds like.
I'm actually not still a great prayer. I definitely am not great. I feel like I don't think I've ever seen Landon not like say a prayer before bed or say a prayer when he wakes up. Like, it's just instinct. He gets down on his knees, he leaves, he gets down on his knees, he gets in bed. And I've never been really good at that, but I felt like I was able to in my calling. Maybe there's something in me that feels like I can't ask God for things that I need, but I felt like there were often times where I was incapable of helping sisters, but God could do it. So it just felt like there was time where one of my friends texted me and she was like, my baby hasn't slept for 4 nights and I am so tired. And, it's 11 o'clock at night and I'm like, I can't do anything for you. But I remember being like, Heavenly Father, like, I am the Relief Society president of the 6th Ward and I have access to priesthood power and I need you to help little Elena sleep tonight because, Caitlin is really tired. And I did that a couple of times where I just gave all of it to God and was like, I can't do anything about the situation. But you can. And then it was great. I mean, this didn't always happen, but Elena slept for 4 hours that night and she got some sleep and that was really great. So I definitely used that tool a lot. And fasting, when you have babies and you're breastfeeding and you just get out of the habit of fasting. I'd been doing that for 10 years. I hadn't really fasted a lot. But every fast Sunday, I had sisters who needed help and I had things I needed to try to discover to help them. And I religiously fasted and I fasted for them and I fasted. And I mean, I remember one time we as a presidency fasted that we would be able to knock on some doors that we couldn't get into. And we knocked on 9 doors and we got into 8 of them on that fast Sunday, which is just like never, ever happened again. So from a testimony standpoint, I guess this is maybe less for the sisters, but I just used those religiously. I fasted and I prayed and I read my scriptures as much as I could to try to help.
Love it. And just those, because there will be those moments in leadership experiences where it's like something terrible is happening, or like someone needs help, and I literally, as a mortal, I cannot, I'm out of bandwidth, or I can't reach them, or they're far away, or whatever it is, where literally all you have is to draw upon the powers of heaven and pray for them, and that's okay. That's just these sweet experiences that come from it. It's powerful, for sure. Anything else about prayer or fasting that you mentioned there? You got it?
I do think I've gotten better at it, though. Like, even just retelling that, like, sometimes I say I'm not a good prayer, but maybe I should stop saying that, because
there you go. I should give you a dose of your own medicine.
Yeah,
Becca, come on.
Yeah,
you don't know what you're talking about, right?
I do think I pray. I do think I'm learning
Look at that.
how to do that. Yeah.
That's awesome. Awesome. Yeah. Any other point, principle, story that we need to make sure we include, or how do we do?
I loved being release study president. It was really great. And
nice.
I still feel very overwhelmed as Young Women's president. And I think every day I wake up and think, oh, it's so much easier being the release study president. So I don't have anything else. I'm really grateful to a bishop, a couple of bishops who followed Revelation. And I should say that my elders quorum president was really great at listening to my doubts all the time and loving me still. So he was also really helpful. And my presidency. So
yeah, awesome. So I have two more questions for you. I usually have one, but I'm curious, like, to come full circle here. Like, what did being release study president do for your faith and your belief, your testimony?
Yeah, I mean, if you haven't caught by now, it did a lot. I decided at the beginning that I was going to give it to God, this God that I wasn't sure existed, and I was going to give him my everything, and that I hoped that by the end that I would know that that he was real, and I do. I know that he's real. And I think that we can do that with all sorts of things. I don't think we have to be the Relief Society president, but we can give our whole effort into trying to know God is real. And we can take our time in doing that. And I hope that people do that who are struggling.
Yeah. So, isn't that just a beautiful grace that God gives us, that even he allows us to have faith in him, even when we're not sure that he exists.
Yeah.
That's so amazing to me. I mean, it's simple, but it's amazing.
He's probably like, Becca, you're such an idiot. Like, come on. Like, I've showed you so many times. And sometimes I get frustrated with myself. Like, I have this weird thing where I watch a TV show and I can rewatch that TV show and forget everything that's ever happened. And I feel like that's part of my problem, is I have a harder time, like, remembering all these spiritual experiences and relying on them. Yeah. And so it's just this constant, like, Groundhog Day for me with my testimony, and I've just accepted it.
Well, and you can do that as many times as it takes. He'll always.
I'm just going to keep going. I'm going to keep doing it.
That's right. Yeah. All right. Last question I have for you, Becca, is, as you reflect on your time as a leader, how has being a leader helped you become a better follower of Jesus Christ?
So I think that as a leader, you have a beautiful opportunity to see some really hard things, and things that are not the fault of that person, or things that are. And I mean, I went and did lots of needs assessments and food orders and visits where I would leave and think, man, if every single person could just have these experiences, they would want to do so much more. And, that's what the Savior did, is he just went and tried all he could to help people's loads be lighter. And I just see him as only doing good. And I just wanted to be more like him.